Brian Hooker's attorney says that he was questioned for hours in relation to whether or not he caused harm, which resulted in Lynette's death. Lynette Hooker's body has not been found at this point. Brian says his wife fell overboard last Saturday. The sun, I think the way he put it, actually set like 20 minutes after she fell off the dinghy. And the way the law works in the Bahamas is his detention can be extended until around 7:30 p.m.
He thought the map made him look helpful. He thought it told his story. He thought handing it to friends, to law enforcement, to investigators was the act of a grieving husband doing everything he could. He was wrong. Before this video ends, you're going to see two things that will change how you understand this entire case. First, the number Brian Hooker drew with his own hand. The number now sitting at the center of a criminal investigation on 2 continents. Second, exactly why that number contradicts every single word Brian told police, and why investigators knew it the moment they looked. Stay with us. Both of those promises get paid off before this ends. Lynette Hooker was 55 years old. She was from Onstead, Michigan. She and her husband, Brian, 58, had been married approximately 25 years. To the thousands who followed them on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube under the handle The Sailing Hookers, they looked like people who had genuinely pulled it off. They bought a sailboat in Texas. They repaired it by hand. They simply left. Lynette posted cinnamon rolls baked on board, sea turtles gliding under the hull, a floating bar near a sandbar on calm days. Her last TikTok posted 2 days before she disappeared. 2 days. And then the account stopped in the middle of a story that never finished. On Saturday evening, April 5th, Brian and Lynette left Hopetown at approximately 7:30 p.m. dinner and drinks at the Abaco Inn. Then, a short dinghy ride back to their anchored yacht, the Soulmate, 2.5 miles away. A trip they had made before. A trip that should have taken 4 minutes. So why did it take 8.5 hours for Brian to reach shore? And why, when he finally did, was Lynette nowhere? You just heard what Brian wanted the world to see. Now hear what he actually said, and what he left out. Here is Brian Hooker's account. His words, his version, every detail exactly as he presented it to friends, to family, and to investigators. He says the winds were running around 20 knots. He says Lynette basically just bounced off the dinghy in the middle of a sudden blow. He says the sun had set roughly 10 minutes after she entered the water. Darkness came almost immediately. He threw her a flotation cushion, the one they used to sit on in the dinghy. I threw her a flotation cushion that we used to sit on the dinghy, right after she went in. Neither of them was wearing a life jacket. And then he says the dinghy key went overboard with Lynette. It was not clipped to anything. The spare key was inside her dry bag. That went in with her too, both keys, in the water, engine dead. He says he tried to paddle toward her. The wind blew them apart almost instantly. A pin on one of his oars broke. He had trouble with the anchor. He set off flares and got no response. Over 8.5 hours, he says conditions kept working against him, pushing him further from where she went in. He paddled to shore. That is his account. Now place it beside one question Lynette's daughter Carly has been asking since day one. In every video they ever posted from that dinghy, Brian was always driving. Brian was always at the helm. Brian was always in control of the key. Carly told CBS News exactly what that means. Brian's always driving, so he basically is in charge of the key. Why was she swimming away from the boat? Why did she have the key? The story just does not make sense to me. Here is what we now know about that night that Brian never volunteered. They left 4 minutes after sunset. The light was already failing when they pushed off. It was pitch dark on open water. Neither of them wore a life jacket. Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team leader Richard Cook described the conditions without softening. Nighttime, very windy, no moon out yet. So it was pitch dark, very rough conditions for the small boat they were in. He called the decisions made that evening Post-sunset departure, no life jackets, that vessel in those seas. A lot of bad decisions. No one who knows those waters has said otherwise. Promise one is now paid. Well, you know what Brian said. You know what the conditions were. Now we get to what investigators found when they started pulling the timeline apart. The timeline does not just raise questions, it raises a number, and that number has a direction. Brian Hooker arrived at the Marsh Harbor Boatyard at 4 in the morning on Sunday, April 6th. He did not pull up to a dock. He beached the dinghy. He walked through the bush on foot until a boatyard employee found him and contacted the authorities. Police were notified around 4 a.m. That notification came 8.5 hours after Brian says Lynette entered the water. 8.5 hours, during which no official search was underway. No distress signal had been sent, no emergency channel had been hailed, no phone was aboard, according to Brian. Think about what that means. Their friend Blaine Stevenson told CBS News that the Hookers always had their phones with them. They filmed content on the water constantly. But the one night Lynette disappeared was the night there was no phone aboard. That question has not been answered. Here are 5 contradictions that investigators have now assembled and that no public statement from Brian has addressed. Brian says the currents and wind made it impossible to reach Lynette. Yet he completed a 4-mile open-water paddle that same night in those same conditions. Brian privately told their friend Daniel Danforth that Lynette was casually swimming back toward the sailboat, but the official police account described strong currents carrying her out to sea. In every piece of content they posted, Brian drove the dinghy and controlled the key. Yet that night, Lynette had both keys. Brian says no phone was aboard, yet their own boating community confirms they filmed water content regularly and always carried devices. After Lynette disappeared, Brian moved the Soulmate from Elbow Cay, where she was anchored the night of the disappearance, to Marsh Harbor. Their mutual friend Danforth told CBS News that movement concerned him directly. Now, the maps. Promise 2. In the days after Lynette's disappearance, while the search was still active, Brian opened the Navionics app on his phone. He pulled up charts for the waters around Hopetown, Elbow Cay, and Marsh Harbor. He marked the position where he says Lynette went overboard. He drew the route the dinghy took after she went in. He marked where he ended up. He then sent those annotated screenshots from his own phone, in his own hand, to friends, to other boaters, and to law enforcement. CBS News obtained those maps on April the 12th, 2026. When their team measured the distance between the 2 points Brian marked himself, where he says Lynette entered the water and where he says he arrived on shore, one number came out of his own annotations: 4 miles. Before we get to what that number actually proves, tell us in the comments, does the casually swimming detail change how you read Brian's account? Because investigators flagged it immediately. 4 miles is not just a distance. It is a physics argument, and the physics do not lie. Emergency response diving instructor and police diver Ben Doan analyzed this case publicly. What he said is not speculation. It is geometry. If Brian Hooker was physically capable of paddling 4 miles across open Bahamian water in an 8-foot dinghy over 8.5 hours in the dark, and his own map confirms that he was, then his body was also capable of paddling toward where his wife entered the water. That is the point. Not that Brian should have saved her, not that rescue was guaranteed. The point is that the physical capacity required for the 4-mile journey to shore was the exact same capacity required to paddle in the other direction. Now consider the current. Brian's account places enormous weight on the wind and currents as the forces that separated them. The conditions, he says, made it impossible. But the current running in that area on that night was moving west, toward the Abaco mainland, toward Marsh Harbor. That is the direction Brian ended up. Yet the current was not opposing his journey to shore. The current was behind him, and here is what that means precisely. If the current carried Brian 4 miles west, it was carrying Lynette west too, toward the same coastline he was paddling toward, not away from it. They were in the same body of water, subject to the same forces. The ocean was not selectively pushing Brian toward Marsh Harbor while sending Lynette somewhere else. Brian is also a Marine veteran. The physical conditioning, the water training, the capacity to operate under pressure in difficult environments. That background does not make a 4-mile open water paddle in the dark sound extraordinary. It makes the claim that he could not reach his wife in the same water on the same night with the same current running behind him considerably harder to accept. And then there is what happened on the night of his arrest. Police escorted Brian by boat to search the soulmate. He went overboard on a wet deck in choppy water. Officers pulled him out in minutes, while he was handcuffed. The man who says conditions made it impossible to reach his wife went into those same waters and was retrieved in minutes while restrained. If this case matters to you, subscribe to The Vanished Case right now. What comes next is the part that changes everything. The same water, the same conditions. The only difference was who was waiting on the other side. If the current was running west for both of them and Brian completed 4 miles in that direction, what do you think explains the gap between what he says he tried to do and what his own map shows he actually did? Put your answer below. Investigators now have his map, his number, his contradictions, and a charging deadline. Here is where this case stands tonight. The Royal Bahamas Police Force arrested Brian Hooker on Wednesday, April 9th, 4 days after Lynette's disappearance. His attorney confirmed that during a second interrogation on Friday, April 11th, investigators used the specific phrase causing harm, which resulted in her death. NBC News reported prosecutors are weighing a potential murder charge. Under Bahamian law, the deadline to charge or release Brian was Monday, April 13th, last night. By the time you watch this video, that decision has already been made. But here is what does not stop regardless of what that decision was. The U.S. Coast Guard opened its own independent criminal investigation. They interviewed Lynette's daughter Carly for 2 hours after Brian's arrest. That federal probe does not depend on the Bahamian timeline. It does not stop because a detention window closes. The maps are published. The contradictions are on the record. The 4 miles are documented in Brian's own hand on a chart he drew, distributed, and submitted to law enforcement himself, believing it helped his story. Lynette's mother, Darlene, told CNN her family has many unanswered questions and is still holding on for a positive outcome. Carly has said consistently she does not want anything bad to happen to Brian. She just needs to know what happened to her mother. So does everyone watching this. If Brian walks free because there is no body, does the evidence trail still hold? Or does the absence of remains make justice impossible in this case? Tell us what you think. This community sees things the coverage misses. If this video gave you something the mainstream coverage didn't, subscribe to The Vanished Case right now. Share this with anyone following the case. More is coming on Lynette Hooker, and you need to be here when it drops. Every case matters. Every clue counts.